So, Peter, as we just heard in the introduction, one, we want to thank again Mr. Steve Scully for opening so many doors, including the one to you to bring us here. We heard that just most recently you were on Meet the Press. Today you're on Erie News Now. Now you're on the Global Summit stage. When we were initially planning this several months ago, I think we planned that we were going to talk mostly about Ukraine and Russia and what's happening here domestically and the United States' role in global affairs. Certainly I want to get to those, but 16 days ago, Hamas attacked Israel. Just last week, you were on Air Force One. You had good advice on how not to die. You're here with us tonight. Take us to Air Force One and that flight that was planned quickly, very publicly for President Biden. What did that mean? What was it like?
Well, first of all, thank you guys for coming. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really honored to be part of this remarkable forum that you all have established here. I'm a big fan of Steve Scully, as you just mentioned. I want to thank Furky. I want to thank Lisa. I want to thank the whole folks at Gannon. This is just a really, really big treat for me. So I'm glad to be here. And I have been here now 3 times in Erie in the last 5 years, because Erie is, in fact, the center of national politics. It's true. I've come twice before this for big political rallies, so I'm glad that I'm glad to be back. And so yeah, Air Force One. It was unlike any trip I've ever taken. I have covered the White House with a few breaks since 1996, and I've been on Air Force One a lot. But I've never been on a trip like this before. Now, presidents don't normally be brought to places where they might shoot at them. That's just kind of a basic rule the Secret Service has. In fact, it's the rule the Secret Service has, right? Now, presidents have done it before. The first president ever to fly overseas into a war zone was actually FDR. He went to Casablanca during the North Africa campaign. They told the reporters he was going to Hyde Park, and they put him on a train heading north. And then when the reporters weren't looking, they put him on a train going south. And they got on a plane to fly to North Africa. And of course, Presidents Bush and Obama, they went to Iraq and Afghanistan, but they went under the cover of night. They also didn't tell anybody until they had landed and they were safe. This was a very different kind of trip. In this trip, we had announced that we were going before we took off, and it was going to be covered live on Israeli television and therefore international television when we landed at an airport where the international carriers had stopped flying because it's within range of the rockets from Gaza. So very different kind of trip for a president. You can imagine how our friends in the Secret Service were feeling about this. And they did come to the back of the plane, and they sat down and gave us a briefing I've never had before on the plane, and they gave us a little card telling us what to do if there was a rocket attack. The long and short of it is, you're in trouble. Because you know what, when the guys with the guns are going to do something when there's a rocket attack, it's not the reporters they're going to be worrying about. I'm just telling you, right? In fact, they did give us a phone number to call if we got left behind by Air Force One. So it was a different kind of trip. And it was a different kind of trip also politically because it was very seat of the pants. The second half of the trip was going to be a stop in Amman, Jordan, where he was going to meet with Arab leaders. And that got canceled literally as the plane was rolling to take off, which I've never had that happen before either, where an international trip was suddenly truncated in half while we were wheels up from Andrews. So that was a very unusual thing. That was because of course, the Gaza hospital bombing. So it was a very emotional trip, of course, for the president. I was in the room with him when he met with survivors and relatives of some of the victims of the Hamas terrorist attack. He was crying. They were crying. One of them was a friend of ours, somebody we knew in Israel, and we were based there briefly. And the stories were wrenching and horrible. And of course, the stories we're now hearing from Gaza are also very tragic in the case of a lot of civilians. So it's a very big moment in Middle East history that's unlike, I think, anything we've had in a long time.
So your take on why make it so public? We're going to do this thing. We're announcing it. We just heard the president last week talk about his trip into Kyiv, and that was under cloak of night. That was in a train ride that took 9 hours, blacked out windows, small team, and once he got there, we then knew. Why make this so public? What was the purpose of that for the American people, in your estimation, for the world, in your estimation?
It's a good question, and they didn't really give us a good answer. I think part of it was the very act of going was the point, right? He wanted to show unequivocal support by the United States for Israel in a time of great trauma for the country. I mean, think about what Israel has been through, right? 1,400 deaths, 200 people taken hostage for a country of less than 10 million. I mean, think about that. We had 3,000 killed in 9/11 for a country of 300 million, right? You can argue that this is like 15 or 20 times of 9/11 in that sense, proportionately. And everybody in Israel knew somebody there who was affected by this. And I think he just wanted to make a very public display that nobody was going to get between him and Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have some thoughts about how Israel handles the reaction to this. He's very concerned, I think, about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza right now and how Israel now approaches its coming ground invasion if it launches one. And so he made a point while we were there of talking about our experience of 9/11. And he says, we understand, we Americans, we understand the all-consuming rage you're feeling right now. We felt that ourselves. But not to give in, he urged them to the primal feeling that, in his case, his argument is that we made some mistakes afterwards. Don't make the mistakes we made. So it was a powerful message, I think.
I think that we thought, or we at least anticipated, the ground invasion was going to happen Friday, maybe Saturday, maybe Sunday. Here we are Monday night. In your estimation, is it President Biden's visit, the U.S.'s involvement that's delayed that? What are the factors that are leading to a delay for the ground invasion for Israel?
I think part of it, of course, is the Americans. What they'll tell you is they're not telling the Israelis what to do. We're not dictating to them, they say. But they are asking pointed questions. Okay, when you go in, what do you plan to do? How do you plan to do it? What is your expectation for this? How do you get out? What do you do the day after, right? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, you're actually able to take out Hamas, which by itself would be an enormous challenge and possibly not manageable. What do you do the next day? Because we've seen it, right? The next day question shouldn't be left for the next day, because then you have a lot of trouble. And so I think in asking these questions, that had the effect to some extent of saying to them, don't be in too much of a hurry. And obviously there's a desire to get the hostages out as much as possible. We had 2 more released today. So I think that's part of it. I think also part of it is the Israelis getting themselves ready. Because while they have an off-the-shelf plan for an invasion of Gaza, the truth is this is a big, big challenge that they're about to take on if they go in. David Petraeus, the former Iraq commander and Afghanistan commander, the other day in a conversation with my wife compared it to Mogadishu. Anybody remember Somalia and Black Hawk Down? He says, like Mogadishu on steroids, right? Imagine Mogadishu with a network of tunnels. Tunnels isn't really even describe what's underneath Gaza. My Pentagon colleague today said it's more like an underground city, all right? And as a military challenge, trying to uproot an enemy in that kind of a circumstance in an urban setting where you don't really know the difference between civilians and combatants, it's a big thing for them to do. So I think that they're taking a little bit of time to get ready.
So I know this wouldn't be the case at Gannon University because I'm a proud alumni, and I know they teach wonderful history here, and people would understand the history of the Middle East. I was going to ask you to just unpack that because a lot of us, I feel like, are catching up to speed in real time of what exactly is happening and who all is involved and how we got here. I know we could spend all week talking about that, so I'll give you a minute to think about that, but I'll ask another question first about Air Force One. The president came back and met with the press. That's not something he seems to do often. What was that like?
Yeah. He has not, in fact, done that at all since he became president. He has only come back on Air Force One to the press cabin one other time, and it was off the record. And I can say that it was reported by Politico. I was not there, so I'm not violating any off the record, but it was reported by Politico that session was to tell us how much he doesn't like our coverage. So this is a little bit different. He came back, and by the way, he is not unique as a president that way. That they all feel that way. This time was the first time he came back and talked to us on the record. He came back at a refueling stop in Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and he had just gotten off the phone with President Sisi of Egypt, and he wanted to come back to tell us that he had gotten Sisi to agree to allow the beginning of humanitarian relief into Gaza. So I think he wanted to make sure that news got out. But he sat there and talked with us for about 15 minutes and took a number of questions. He talked about how much the Israel experience had weighed on him, how much it really affected him seeing all those people. He talked about his message to Prime Minister Netanyahu. We got in a question about the House of Representatives and the dysfunction there. He was asked, well, do you feel really bad for Jim Jordan? He says, oh, I ache for him. And one of my colleagues says, really? No. 0, he said. So it was a chance to get a chance to talk to him in a less formal setting, and if it were up to me, I think we should do that more often.
So, before we get to the dysfunction in the House right now, because we've been updating what we're going to talk about leading up to the very minute that we're getting on stage for that, I do want to go back to, in a nutshell, Peter, what are the important...
You didn't have no Speaker of the House in the bingo card for...
You know, I didn't have that on my bingo card. If anybody did, I think you've won, or that it would be the first time in U.S. history that we've gone without a speaker for 20 days now. So we'll get to that in a minute, though. But the important highlights of what we have to understand, I wanted you to unpack it just a little bit for us before I start asking you questions about Iran's involvement, because we heard Secretary of State Anthony Blinken talking about the concern over proxies in other ways that it may be more destabilized in the Middle East. What are the most important things that we hear tonight as we continue to look and watch the conflict play out in Israel? What do we need to be most mindful of?
Well, I think that's it. I think at the moment, the thing that they are most concerned about in the Situation Room in the White House is a wider war, because Iran has proxies in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, obviously Hamas, Yemen. If they decide to go all out, that's a multi-front war for Israel that would drag us in, very likely, right? We have 2 carrier groups now in the Eastern Med. We don't have them there because we want to see the beach. We're there for a reason, and the reason is to try to deter Iran, and specifically Hezbollah, from launching into this war. Hezbollah has roughly 100,000 rockets. Think about that, 100,000 rockets. Israel's now evacuating residential sections near the southern Lebanon border because of those rockets. At the moment, the best American intelligence estimate is that they don't want this. Hezbollah does not want to get into this. But the minute ground war starts in Gaza, all bets are off. You never know what can happen. And you're already seeing danger. You're seeing us pull American diplomats out of Baghdad and Erbil. You're seeing reports of drones being shot down by American forces that we think may have been targeting either us or Israel. So you see, already skirmishing around the region that could portend to something much, much bigger and much more dangerous.
So the president was talking to you and your colleagues on the flight back, and then addresses the American people. Let's talk about the speech, because to you, what stands out? And then I want to talk about the narrative of weaving together an aid package aimed at both Ukraine and Israel, and the United States' role in that. I don't know about you, but I sensed some Reagan-esque language in that speech. The beacon, the shining hill, our role. What stood out to you? And then weaving the narrative of tying this aid package together, that America is going to support both Israel and Ukraine, and this is something Americans should get behind.
Yeah, look, I think it's important. The speech was important for him. He's only given one other Oval Office address in prime time since he became president, and that was a few months ago for the debt ceiling crisis. He's never really spent a lot of time trying to explain to Americans and the public why Ukraine matters to us, why it matters to Americans in the United States. He's given some pretty good, strong speeches about that in Warsaw and overseas, but he hasn't spent a lot of time addressing Americans in a very direct way as he did on Thursday night. And people have been bothering him about that. They've been bugging him. You need to get out there and sell this, because there is now growing fatigue with this war. Why are we spending so much money on a faraway place? These are our tax dollars, and we've got a lot of other priorities here at home, people are asking. So he was already thinking about giving a speech about Ukraine when the Israel thing happened, and they decided to merge them together. Now, the speech is a little jarring at times, because he's kind of flipping back and forth like a video game between Israel and Ukraine. Wait, what's the connection? But he's trying to make the connection that internationalism still matters, that American leadership on the world stage matters, and that while Putin is not exactly the same thing as Hamas, that there is a through line of attacks on democracies that are our friends, Ukraine and Israel, and that we have a stake in that. That this matters to us. That's what he's trying to say. He's trying to say this matters to us, and this is why it matters to us. And yes, I'm about to ask you to spend a lot of your hard-earned money on this so that we don't have to have a worse outcome. It's a tough sell. There is growing skepticism. Polls show it on both sides of the aisle, particularly right now politically on the House Republican conservative side. And that's why he marries Ukraine with Israel, because Israel right now, there's a pretty strong bipartisan feeling of wanting to help them out. You marry that to Ukraine, where there's some doubts among the hard right in the House. You marry that also with border protection money, which is another favorite of the conservatives in the House, and some Taiwan money in Asia again. You're trying to put together a package that may seem unseemly or like a gangly package, but it's meant to attract enough votes to get past the opposition.
So not only international issues, you had recently written about Biden's tackling junk fees. So it seems to me as if trying to address the economy and look nationally while also explaining America's role abroad, he's learned from history and what happened to George H.W. Bush, that too much focus away from the United States, eye off of the economy, loses the election to Clinton. Am I right on that? What, do you think that he's trying to keep Americans focused enough that he's being mindful of 2024 here?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. His aides would tell you they're not specifically focused on the Bush lesson, but that is the lesson for all presidents, right? President Bush 41 successfully managed the end of the Cold War without a great eruption of violence. He helped reunify Germany. He prosecuted the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein and Kuwait successfully. This is the Iraq War that worked out pretty well, at least from our point of view. And yet his 90% approval rating led to a defeat just a year later. Why? Because a lot of people felt like he took his eye off the ball here at home, that there was a recession, we had domestic issues, the Cold War is over, we don't need to think about overseas as much anymore. What Clinton told us was it's the economy, stupid. So Biden has incorporated that in his mind, and he did an event last week in the middle of this Israel thing about junk fees, which are those fees that airlines put on you and hotels put on you and insurance companies put on you and everybody puts on you without telling you. And suddenly you look at the bill, you say, well, that's twice as much as I thought I was going to pay. That matters to a lot of people. It's a lot of money. And it hits people right at home. So he wanted to continue to do that event anyway, even though he's managing this overseas crisis, to say to Americans, look, I still understand where you're feeling, what you're thinking about, and I'm not taking my eye off the ball. He gave another speech today on Bidenomics. Now, it's not going to penetrate with the wall-to-wall coverage. He knows that. But he wants to be able to continue that message so that people understand that he's focused here at home, not just overseas.
So turning to Russia, but looking at the implications now, what is Russia's involvement, attitude, temperature toward what's happening in Israel right now? Because I want to talk first about the short-term implications of Russia's attack on Ukraine, but how Russia is now looking at the Middle East. What are you seeing?
Yeah, this is a very interesting thing because Israel has not been particularly outspoken against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A lot of people are upset about that. Why wasn't Israel speaking out more? Why weren't they on the side of the Ukrainians here? And part of it is because the Russians have forces in the Middle East that matter to Israel, particularly in Syria. And they're very calculating about that, the fact that they need to make sure they're not at odds with Russia in their view back then. Putin's view of this is now more and more influenced by his relationship with Iran, who is giving him the drones and other weapons he needs for the fight in Ukraine that nobody else will sell him. And Iran, of course, is the sponsor of Hamas. Whether they had something specifically to do with this or not, there's a debate about that among intelligence experts, but they're certainly a patron of Hamas, no matter how you look at it. And so Russia has not, in fact, come to Israel's defense on all of this. And it's a striking thing because, and the Israelis are mad. They're very mad about that. But the Ukrainians are saying, hey, we're the ones who told you. You can't trust these guys. See what happens.
Your New York Times colleague, Thomas Friedman, had a piece out calling for a re-emphasis of the two-state solution to really figure it out now. Is that something that can be done in this current moment? I hear you when you talk about President Biden's speech of don't be filled with rage. You know, we felt that afterwards. Is this something that we can actually move forward with globally, or is this a non-starter?
Well, I don't think it's a starter anyway. At the moment, it'd be very hard to see how you would do something on that front. The two-state solution has basically been moribund for years for a lot of reasons, leadership issues on both sides, honestly. Who is it the Israelis are supposed to negotiate with? Netanyahu wasn't all that interested in negotiating anyway. He's got his own politics on the hard right to worry about. But it is true that history has given us some lessons, and out of the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, when Israel's attacked by Egypt and Syria in a surprise on their holiest holiday, out of that came a few years later the Middle East peace deal with Jimmy Carter at Camp David. So you never know. I mean, I think it's wrong to rule something out in the long term. Now, the way that Biden is approaching this is trying to reconcile or bring together Saudi Arabia and Israel. If the Saudis recognize Israel and establish normal diplomatic relations the way the Bahrainis and the Emiratis and a few others have done, then that transforms the region. But the price of doing that is some sort of resolution, if not a final resolution, at least some sort of resolution on the Palestinian question, because the Saudis feel the need to insist on that as part of a deal. It's hard at this particular moment to see how that happens. But again, we didn't see Sadat and realize what he was going to do and what Jimmy Carter would do at Camp David, and so we'll see.
Before we move on to talking about Ukraine and Russia, I just want to recap current role and role the U.S. would like them to play in Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. Where are they currently in this mix? Where might the U.S. want to see them being supportive, being helpful, or taking no action in Israel?
Sorry, we want to see.
So we're looking at Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. What role are they currently playing on the ground? What might the U.S. wish they were doing, let's say, a week from now?
Well, I mean, Egypt has been the frustrating case, right? Because they control the Rafah crossing into Gaza, where a lot of our American citizens, hundreds apparently, have not been able to get out. And they control the humanitarian aid going in. Now, there is a concern about the humanitarian aid getting in the hands of Hamas, right? So that has been a factor in holding that up. But the Egyptians control that in a way that nobody else does. So they have a key role to play. They also are one of the few forces that have had any influence in dealing with Hamas over the years in de-escalating past conflicts. Jordan is the King Abdullah tried to have this four-way summit with President Biden during that trip. It would have been the second stop, the one that got canceled. His own politics are complicated. He's got a lot of Palestinians in his country. He has to worry about the street, even though he's obviously not a Democrat. He is very close to being, the best friend Americans have there in general, but he has this very tough line to walk because they are constantly afraid of being overthrown in Amman there. And then Lebanon is a basket case in which basically Hezbollah has the right, has the impunity to do what it wants. And it's a horrible thought to think that Lebanon is going to be once again thrown into some sort of fratricidal war that will once again pull it back years.
So no soldiers on the ground we hear, but there are a lot of sailors in the Mediterranean Sea. What does the U.S. military involvement look like as this continues to wage on?
Yeah, we have we have the two carrier groups, and we've gotten an increase in land-based aircraft in the region, about 100 combat aircraft now available to us. And the unspoken message is to Hezbollah, try something and you're going to be paying a price, and it's going to be through air power and naval power. We have obviously Tomahawk missiles and these carrier and land-based strike groups. That's not risk-free, obviously, for American flyers and sailors, but obviously it's a whole lot better than boots on the ground. We do have some boots on the ground in the form of special ops experts at commando raids. They are currently advising the Israelis as they're thinking about what to do in terms of hostage rescues. We have skin in the game. We have several of those hostages are ours. We don't know exactly how many, but there are 10 Americans who are unaccounted for. But what we've been told again and again is that they will not participate in any ground operation. Israelis have for 75 years said that basically Israelis will defend themselves by themselves. They do not want foreign troops on the ground to help them. They feel like that subjugates them to another country and diminishes their deterrence. But our guys are there to advise them at the very least.
So a year and a half ago, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. Here we are. He thought he'd take it in 3 days. A year and a half later, here we are. What is the end game? $1 million question. But will he give up? Will he turn back?
No, the answer is no, he won't give up. History tells us that the leaders who start bad wars are not the ones who end them, right? It wasn't Brezhnev who ended Afghanistan, and when the Soviets went, it was Gorbachev. It wasn't Johnson who ended the Vietnam War. It was Nixon. It wasn't Truman who ended Korea. It was Eisenhower. It wasn't Bush who headed Iraq. It was Obama. The person who starts a war that doesn't go very well is politically too tied in, historically, to switch gears and give up. They would believe that that would be, for Putin in particular, it could be the end of his reign, it could be the end of his life. So as long as he's there, it's hard to see how they, pull back. And it's hard to see a negotiated solution that anybody could live with. Remember, he negotiated 2 accords called the Minsk Accords back in 2014 when they first invaded, and nobody really lived up to that. So, the flip side is I don't know that the Ukrainians can necessarily push them out entirely with military force, and that leaves the idea that you may have a frozen conflict for years. It could be a lower grade than it has been perhaps, but it's hard to see, some sort of a resolution for a while. If you're Putin right now, especially, you're playing for time. He's watching our politics. He's seeing what's happening. He knows there's a chance that Congress won't approve more aid. If we don't approve more aid, the game is different. Secondly, he's watching our presidential race. He knows that if Trump wins, it's a different game as well. Trump has said, in effect, that he would, quote, negotiate an end to this in a day. The only way you negotiate an end to that in a day is by simply handing over Ukraine. Putin would be more than happy to have Trump in there doing that. So from Putin's point of view is, wait us out. See if he can wait until we have lost our energy for it, if we change our political leadership, and we basically give up.
So earlier in the introduction, Lisa Adams did a wonderful job of mentioning the first book you and your wife wrote together, Kremlin Rising. How different or how similar is Vladimir Putin of that era and of Vladimir Putin today? Has he grown as a leader? Has he changed as a leader? Or is he still the same?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a big question that we're actually trying to tackle with a new book. So you're right on point for us.
So new book. When are you coming back to Erie for this?
Yes. But you got to give me some time. We haven't written any of it yet.
Well,
we're going to write a book about the 5 American presidents who have dealt with Putin, and how each of them judged him or misjudged him, how they dealt with him, what led them to the decisions they made, what their assessment of Putin was, and how and this question of whether he changed or not. The Putin we saw when we lived there was the first 4 years of Putin's term, and we felt at the time it was pretty clear he was not the westernizer, modernizer friend that we in the West hoped he would be. The very first story we covered was him taking over independent television and then kicking out the big businessmen, the oligarchs, who stood up to him, and making the parliament a pocket parliament with no real opposition. The day of the Beslan terrorist attack, I don't know if you remember that, but in 2004, terrorists attacked a school in Beslan, Russia, southern Russia, and the Russian forces went in. It was a bloodbath. 330-some people died, including 180 children. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen in covering anything, including Afghanistan, Iraq. And Putin used that to eliminate the election of governors. How that had anything to do with fighting terrorism in the Caucasus, I don't know. He never really explained it. It really wasn't the point. So we saw at the time somebody who was consolidating power at home. I don't think we necessarily realized that he would last as long as he has, and they would do such a good job consolidating power at home, he could begin to be more aggressive in the near abroad. That's the term that they use for the former Soviet republics like Georgia, like Ukraine, like the Baltics. He couldn't do that when we were there because Russia wasn't strong enough at that point, but it has gotten stronger over time economically and so forth. Now, we've now seen the power of their military. He's now shown us that it was more of a paper tiger than they had let on. But he is the same person that we saw then, I think. I think he was so aggrieved by the end of the Soviet Union. Remember, he called it the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. He was so aggrieved by that, so aggrieved at the notion of lost greatness, державность in Russia, that he was determined to reassert itself on the world stage. And he has become, I think, probably more messianic in his view of it, more like, I'm going to be like the czars and I'm going to reconstitute Russia the way it ought to be.
And does that seem to be at all costs? Because if Vladimir Putin wants Ukraine so bad, why bomb it, obliterate it, kill so many Ukrainians to get this thing?
this is all he knows. This is how he came to power. He came to power as prime minister of Russia, launching a second war in Chechnya that was about carpet bombing Grozny to tears. More munitions were dropped on the Chechen capital of Grozny in 1999, 2000, when he was first taking over, than were dropped on Dresden during World War II. He carpet bombed it. Tens and tens of thousands of civilians killed. We knew then, 24 years ago, what he was like. We didn't see what it would become. He did the same thing in Syria, honestly, when he sent in the Russian forces in 2015 to Syria to intervene there. Indiscriminate use of force, no care for civilians. And the point of winning over Ukraine is not to have intact cities, it is to have it answered to him.
How concerned are you that as time weighs on and as he continues to wage this war, he starts making friends and he starts getting support in his effort? What should we be most concerned about? We see the Iranian relationship with Russia. We see North Korea. We see China. What are you most concerned about right now?
I mean, China is what matters, right? This alignment between Russia and China is something we've always talked about, but it never really actuated itself in a real way. Now it seems to be genuinely a real thing. And that's a big change in our geopolitical dynamic and leaves us in a much more dangerous place. Now, he needs China. He is the junior partner to China, much as he might not want to admit it, because China dwarfs Russia economically. But as long as China is willing to let him have the rope that he has, he's willing to use it. And we we have not been able to find a clue to influencing China more than we had. Now, China has not given Russia the weapons that Russia really wants. So in that sense, they have been influenced maybe by us or by the West and the fear of consequences. They have not done everything they could do. But as long as China is Russia's partner, he has a lot of rope.
You mentioned the paper tiger army. Is there a point that we would get to see that Ukraine could defend itself without international support?
Not in the near term, no. I think, look at how critical, look at how critical Western help has been. I mean, you talked about 3 days. They deserve all the credit in the world for defending their country, and they did it without any help at that point that really mattered. But since then, it has mattered a great deal that American munitions and European munitions have been available to them. And I think, by the way, American intelligence help. We don't talk about that very much. We're helping them figure out their targets. We're helping them know what's coming, to anticipate attacks. The anti-aircraft batteries that we have given them have meant that they can, in fact, reestablish a kind of semi-normal life in much of the country. That is incredibly important. And if we were not to be there, there's no question that they would have a much, much harder time. These ATACMS, these missiles that we just gave them, have had an enormous effect in a very short amount of time. Now, a lot of people have criticized President Biden because he didn't give them to him sooner. But you can see what the impact has been.
So we talked about Putin's relentlessness, and he will not be deterred. Let's talk about Zelensky, the unlikely rise to leadership for a comedian who's now turned global international figure. Does he have the mettle, in your estimation, to be undeterred, to continue fighting? What's most remarkable that you've seen over the past year and a half from Zelensky?
Well, nobody would have thought that he would turn out to be what he turned out to be, right? The Americans underestimated him. The Russians definitely underestimated him. And he turned out to have a lot more mettle than they realized. He has successfully rallied the world in a way that has been remarkable to see. I saw him in Tokyo when he came to, or not Tokyo, in Hiroshima, Japan, when he came for the G7, excuse me. He has a capacity for winning over foreign counterparts. Now, he and Biden have kind of a scratchy relationship, ironically. He's a little aggressive in Biden's view and demanding weapons, and Biden, is a little, I think, has been annoyed at times that hasn't been a little bit more gratitude for what we have done instead of demand for more. But Zelensky has his own politics, and he's got an election next year if they choose to have it. They may not have it because of the current situation, but he has his own politics. And I think his own politics are, he can't simply turn around tomorrow and negotiate an end that simply hands off Ukrainian territory, even territory that they may or may not really care so much about. It's just politically, I think, really hard for him to do that at this point.
So if the U.S. is going to have sustained support in the war in Ukraine, do you think that the American people can stand behind that? We've seen, and rightfully so, in the last few days, it's bumped from the front page. We're now looking at Israel. Are we just going to focus on Israel and we'll forget about Ukraine? What's the fear there that the American people won't have the appetite to see this through?
Well, I think you see the fatigue in polls. You see, everybody was for Ukraine when it first happened, and it was easy to be sympathetic to a country that's being invaded by a larger bullying neighbor. But you'd have more people on the right, and to some extent on the left too, saying, well, wait a second, there's a lot of money here. Why are we getting involved in something so far away? What does it matter to us? This is the challenge for President Biden to make that we talked about earlier. It is off the front pages for now, but it won't be forever. It's still an important story. And we have as many reporters there today as we did 2 weeks ago, and we're going to keep the same journalistic firepower there.
What about the staying power of NATO? How strong is NATO right now? How likely to continue to support Ukraine's cause?
NATO has been has surprised almost everybody. In fact, the Europeans turned out to be even stronger than the Americans expected. Normally, that's not the case. Normally, it's the Americans leading the way. The Europeans are, in some ways, the ones who have kind of pushed the Americans to be a little bit more aggressive than they otherwise might have been, which is a very unusual circumstance. But the future of NATO, it depends, again, in part on us. There's a story in today's on Rolling Stone magazine. There's some good reporters. And not just about the Rolling Stones. They wrote today that Trump is intending to get out of NATO if he wins again. In our book, we I think reveal how close he came to getting out of NATO in his first term. And the only reason he didn't is he had people around him who resisted it, more establishment figures like a Jim Mattis and an H.R. McMaster and John Kelly. Those people won't be there in a second term. He will not pick people like that to be around him in a second term. He will pick people who will encourage him to do the things he wants to do and he wanted to do in his first term but couldn't do because of that internal resistance. So I think NATO's future is very much on the line in November of next year.
So let's use your mention of your book with your wife, Susan.
Is that shameless enough?
As one, a shameless plug by me to say there will be a book signing tonight, and there is a book sale happening, and it is an excellent book. But before we get to Donald Trump, let's talk about Biden just a little bit more. We talked about polls before. We talked about Bidenomics, and we're looking at that. The one number he inarguably cannot change, his age. On the one hand, we do hear he is just simply too old now. He will be too old in 2024 to then govern as president for 4 more years. On the other hand, his experience looks incredibly valuable right now. Time in the Senate, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, as vice president. He's arguably having a good role right now based on his experience. Your take on the pros and cons of President Joe Biden's age?
Well, I think as a matter of politics, his age is obviously his biggest liability, right? 70% of Americans say they're concerned about his age. They wish somebody else would run, including Democrats. This is not a partisan issue, although obviously Republicans have a strong partisan feeling about it. A lot of Democrats wish somebody else younger would run. It is a big issue, and as you say, that's the one issue they can't do anything about. You can't make him younger. Nothing's going to come along that does that. His counter argument is, watch me, see what I do, judge me based on that, not on a number. And you're right, as a foreign policy, veteran, he is in some ways in his place right now. He knows all these leaders. He understands the various factors at play here. He is comfortable managing these issues that may or may not matter enough to Americans. It's a good question. The issue with his age, I think in large part, is partly about the physicality. He presents older than he did just even a few years ago. The shuffle, which his doctors have documented, his voice is very low. It's hard to hear him. I stood right next to him in Air Force One. I had a hard time hearing what he was saying. Now there's a plane, so it's loud, but his voice is low. It doesn't convey the commanding presence that you sort of expect from a president. He He just looks older, and that I think has concerned a lot of people. Having said that, I've known him for a long time. I don't think he's made any decisions that I can see in the last 3 years that he wouldn't have made 10 years ago. I don't see a decision that's different than he would have made, and he's clearly able to, when we ask him questions, he's engaging and he's reacting and he's, snapping at us sometimes, and but he understands. He understands the questions. People in the situation with him tell you he's still as sharp as ever in terms of, putting his finger on the big issues that need to be addressed. He makes some gaffes. He is forgetful at times. He will lapse on a name. I do too. But fortunately, nobody made me president. And I think the question for him is going to be, their calculation is, yes, it's a liability, but when push comes to shove, if it becomes, do you want him again versus Trump again, that the people who are not thrilled with his age are going to pick that over Trump.
So speaking of Trump, is there a pathway for any one of the other candidates? We hear somebody's surging in the polls. It's their moment at this time, but it seems like, take Nikki Haley, for instance, a nice 4% surge in the poll. Donald Trump had more than double that at the same time. We're going to have another debate amongst Republican candidates. Is there any reason we should watch?
Well, that's a great question, actually. Yeah, I mean, they're surging to 9% right now. It's a great surge. Yeah, I think we should still watch. And I say that as somebody who believes in the system and believes in public involvement in the system, because it's not inconceivable that he can't finish the process in some way or another, and one of these people will end up becoming the nominee. I don't see. Let's start by this. 2016 should teach us humility. Do not make predictions, okay? So I'm not going to make any predictions here, because everybody who made predictions in 2016, a lot of them had a lot of egg on their face, including me. Having said that, I don't see the path for anybody currently running to beat him, absent some change that's not evident right now. Now, that change may come up in one of these trials. It may come, maybe a conviction would change the dynamics in a way we haven't seen so far. A lot of us thought an indictment might change the circumstances, and it didn't actually change it for the better for him, right? It made him more popular. So I don't know that a conviction would change his support within the Republican electorate or not. But I don't see how any of them takes him down, especially because they're not even really going after him. I think they're auditioning for the role of backup in case he can't finish the nominating process.
Yeah, it seems even Chris Christie is backed off a bit, but he seems to be the only one that would go head on. They seem to be trying to fight it out amongst themselves.
Because they want his voters. They don't want to offend his voters, right? The calculation was he will implode, he will self-destruct. He's being indicted 4 times, 91 charges. He's got to collapse, right? This is, all history would tell us this is not tenable, and yet it is tenable. He has defied all history up till now. And so their theory of the case is don't attack him because you don't want to alienate his voters. You want those voters to come to you when he is gone. Hasn't worked out because he's not gone.
Is there a pathway forward that the voters go for someone who's not him? Somebody other than the I alone can do this, because I'm not sure I see any of the candidates that can out-Trump Trump that would take his voters.
No. They're not going to take his voters, absent, again, some change in the environment that we don't see at the moment.
So I've just been handed a stack of wonderful questions from our audience that we're going to work our best to get through so that I can get a head start in taking a look at some of your excellent questions and begin asking them. I will shift, though, in American politics to the House. We didn't have this on our bingo card, that we'd be talking about the Speaker of the House. And here we are. Kevin McCarthy, not there. Steve Scalise, not there. Jim Jordan, not there, not there. Tried to get again, not there. We haven't seen... We don't see a solution, and now we have 9 new people vying for Speaker of the House. What does this say about American politics right now?
Well, I think everybody knows what it says. I mean, it's broken right now, right? This is not something we've ever seen before. It's not wrong. It's not unusual to have a party that has disagreements among itself. That's normal, and then sometimes it can be healthy. But we've never seen them fracture midterm like this take out their own speaker and then not be able to replace them. This has never happened in our history. And so we are in uncharted territory. We don't know what's going to happen next. None of these 9 looks like a giant killer. And the problem for them is, can they get not a majority of their Republican colleagues, but can they get almost all of their Republican colleagues? Because we have broken the precedent. It used to be you would never vote against your party's candidate for speaker on the floor, no matter how much you didn't like him or her, right? Democrats, a lot of them had their issues, not most, I said most, that was wrong, but a number of them had their issues with Nancy Pelosi, and some of them even ran against her when they ran for office, saying, I won't vote for speaker again. But when it comes time to being on the floor, party discipline always held, right? You didn't actually take on a speaker of your own party, even if it wasn't your choice. Well, now that that precedent has been broken, all it takes is 5 Republicans to say, no, that's not my guy. And there's no longer this sense of unthinkable scenario by opposing a candidate of your own party on the floor. It's no longer unthinkable because it's happened. So how they get out of this mess, I don't know, but I think, are feeling the pressure of, partly because of Israel. And we have this government shutdown looming in just a few weeks. And that's going to be a big deal. November, I've gotten the date wrong, 11th? Mid-November, at which point the government runs out of money, the national parks close, every government employee, including the uniformed military people, don't get a paycheck, except, by the way, members of Congress. Who gets a paycheck? Members of Congress still get a paycheck. Go figure. That is going to raise the pressure on them to resolve this issue and get this done. Now, we'll see how they respond to that pressure.
One of the audience questions here is noting what you mentioned earlier of President Biden not necessarily aching for Jordan, but not asserting himself into the discussion. Why not?
Well, 2 reasons. One is it's the old, what did Winston Churchill say? When your enemy is busy shooting himself in the foot, don't get in the way, right? So why would he do that? This is, politically, this is obviously good for him. They don't like to say it out loud, but of course they're loving this because their enemies are in shambles. Now, the good government gene side of him, of course, knows that's not a good thing, and it's bad for getting things done, and he has things he wants to get done. It's bad for democracy. He's busy telling the world this is a fight between democracy and autocracy. Part of his challenge is showing that democracy can work. Well, he's not be able to do that right now, right? So he knows that's bad. But on the other hand, it's the idea that he is old-fashioned. The executive doesn't tell the legislative branch who should lead it. And I don't know that he would have any success in doing it anyway, so why, from his point of view, should he do that?
We'll step away from the House for a second and go back to the White House. And one of our audience questions here is thinking about the role that a third-party candidate is going to play. This is a poll I haven't seen. A Harvard-Harris poll on Friday showed that Trump v. Biden v. Kennedy v. West, Trump wins by 7 points. How will a third-party candidate impact this election?
Yeah. That poll, I've seen it. It's a bit of an outlier, so don't take too much with that one poll. But it is true that it doesn't take much in terms of a third-party candidate to make a difference. Ralph Nader got 92,000 votes in Florida in 2000. George Bush won with 537 votes. Now, if you ask those 92,000 presumably pretty lefty voters who were voting for Ralph Nader whether they would prefer Gore or Bush, probably 537 more of them would have preferred Gore. So you can't tell me that a third party doesn't make a difference. That arguably changed that election. So it doesn't take much. And especially we've seen in these 2 elections that Trump was in, how close it was in these 3-4 states that really mattered, including yours, right? But a relative handful of votes difference. 100,000 votes spread in the right states, you'd have a different president right now. And we would have a different president, by the way, in 2017. Hillary came very close, too. So a Cornel West can take up 1%. RFK Jr. now running as an independent. Who knows? He takes a few percent, even just by name recognition. He was getting 10+% in the Democratic primary. And there are going to be a lot of Democrats who say, I don't want Biden. He's too old. I'm mad about inflation. I'm mad about this or that. So it absolutely can make a big difference.
So this person in the audience is wondering what we the people can do about the divide in our government. How can we have any impact outside of voting?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the You sent me a list of possible questions, and one question you asked in your list was, "What's the question you always get that you hate to get?" That's it. That's the question I hate to get. I hate getting that question. Not that it's not a good question; it's the question, right? It's the question. But one thing about being a journalist is we're really good on pointing out the problems. We're really rotten at pointing out the solutions. It's not really our job. But I think that, really, this is a time that requires us to be involved in our politics and our society. And I think there's such a broad and understandable level of disaffection across ideological lines right now with what's going on. Why should I get involved? Look at these people. I don't want anything to do with it. And that's the reason why things don't always work, is because we're not participating enough. And I'm not taking a point of view about which candidate or party. I just think as a general matter that, when politicians are able to narrow the participatory audience, they control it more. And that the best thing we can do is to be involved. I know that sounds saccharine, but it's actually true.
So I appreciate that, and I think it's a testament to being present, being part of it, being here tonight, asking these great questions, for which I will apologize if I steal someone's thunder, because one of the other questions that I sent you is, which question do you wish more people would actually ask you as Chief White House Correspondent? What question don't you get asked often enough that you wish people would ask you?
Oh gosh, why weren't you bosses give you a raise?
So I think you have 400 plus new friends who will be great references for you.
Yeah, look, I get, there's no single question I don't get that I really wish I got. I love events like this, and I love these questions because they are so critical and they're so on point. And I find that often your questions, frankly, are better than our questions that we sometimes ask as media people. And I'm reminded that we need to do our jobs better of asking the right questions and not always the wrong ones. The media plays a role in what's happening in our society. We are part of the problem. Let's face it, we are part of it. The fragmentation of media, the fact that we are increasingly partisan in the media is not a healthy thing. Now, I think it's good. It's healthy to have different voices. I don't mean it that way. I do think it's healthy to have different voices out there. But we are not living in the same fact world as each other, right? It used to be, when a lot of us here in this room grew up, there were 3 networks and a handful of papers and a couple of news magazines, 3 news magazines. And we all started from the basic same fact set. And then we argued about what it meant, right? Once we agree on the facts, then we argue about what to do about them. Fair enough. We're not living in the same fact set. We go to our preferred corner of the internet or the media landscape or social media to listen or be reinforced on the things we already believe are true and don't want to hear anything contrary. And we, the media, play into that, and we collectively as voters and citizens play into that. And so I tell people that we need to be more aware of different points of view. We have become so polarized. I'll give you a statistic. In 1984, roughly half of the congressional districts picked a member of Congress who was different in party than the person they picked for president. They were ticket splitters. They were willing to judge people not just on their party, but on which one they thought was the best candidate. Today, that 50% number is 4%. There are only 5 members of the Senate and 23 members of the House who are picked by voters in their constituencies that were different than the party of the president that was picked. We are isolating from each other, physically, metaphorically, intellectually, culturally, and that is, I think, in some ways, along with all these other things we're talking about, one of the central challenges of our time.
So this person might be thinking about an upcoming event also in the Global Summit that they're attending, to get your thoughts on it as well. Tom Nichols, contributor to The Atlantic, professor, will be here with us next week talking about his views on the decline of democracy, rise of illiberalism. They're asking your take. Is illiberalism on the rise? If so, what do we do?
Yeah, I agree with whatever Tom will tell you. He's super smart and much smarter than I am on stuff like this. Look, illiberalism is not an American phenomenon. It is a global phenomenon right now, at least a Western phenomenon. We've seen it increasingly in Europe, and we've seen it in other places as well. But it's not a guarantee. I mean, look what just happened in Poland. The election there showed a more center-oriented coalition that's now taking over. But it is worrisome to see a country like Hungary, which has been part of the West now for years, flirting with authoritarianism. And what does that tell us? I think illiberalism that's different than conservatism. You know, I asked Trump once, I asked President Trump once at a press conference what he thought about Western liberalism, and he said, "Yeah, California, they're just way too lefty." So we need to define what we mean by liberalism. It's not what we think of as left-right. It's a belief in the system of consent by the governed and protecting the rights of minorities and a government that is accountable to its people. And that's where I think we're in a phase of history right now where it has not been encouraging. But we go through cycles, and they tend to swing back.
So I'm going to steer us back to other topics we've covered because we have excellent questions from our audience. And if there are others, we will try to work them in as best we can. We have some really great ones up here. One is from an eagle-eyed reader of the New York Times who noticed today's editor's note. Tell us what it is and why it matters.
Yeah. So we published an editor's note today, which is not exactly the same thing as a correction. In some ways, it's a more significant communication from our editors to our readers. And it says we did something that didn't work, that was wrong in some way or another. And in this case, we don't do them very often, but when we do them, they're serious. We take it seriously. And this one is about the Gaza hospital story. And as many of you may know, the very first headline on our story said something like hundreds feared killed by Israeli strike, according to the Palestinians, or something like that. It took a couple hours till more information came in, and we changed the headline to be more a little more neutral, a little more skeptical of the claim that Israel was behind it. And the editor's note, I think, tries to explain how we went wrong in that regard. Now, the original headline wasn't wrong. The Palestinians did claim that the Israelis hit an airstrike. It's just that we shouldn't have given so much credence to that claim absent more information. We should have been a little bit more cautious about how quickly we put that headline up. And I think that's what the editor's note is trying to explain, where we think that we went wrong. And it's a reminder that in the fog of war, the first reports are almost always wrong, right? That we should be careful about claims by either side, any side in a conflict, but especially a group like Hamas, which has, is a designated terrorist group, and rely on our independent reporting as much as possible, not on what combatants claim or assert. So hopefully that's a lesson that's learned, and we take our role very seriously. When we do something that we think is wrong, we do try to own up to it and take responsibility for it and make some changes so that we don't do it again.
So one of the remarkable things I think is when a journalist can work together to write something. You and your wife do. Walk us back to how that made sense, why it worked, and the power of two voices instead of one, working together as a couple, not just in the same field, but on the same project.
Yeah. Okay, so my wife and I have written 3 books together, and we were reporters together. And a lot of people ask, how are you still married? She asked that question a lot, actually, I think. I'm lucky. We were lucky. We met in the Washington Post newsroom. And when we met, she was my editor. Okay? So we established the pecking order pretty early. But our relationship has always been both professional and personal at the same time. And for us, it's a great gift because we get to do the thing that really absorbs us with the person that we love. And we don't always agree on everything, and we do have it out from time to time. She wins. She hates when I make that joke. But it's a blessing to be able to share that with somebody with whom you live, and especially during the pandemic when we were all stuck at home with our spouses, maybe some more happily than others, to be able to share a passion like that.
And we already look forward to bringing you back together once you finish the new book. But in the meantime, we'll have to get her here first, and
Rebuttal.
then we can ask her the same questions. But you've also got to be proud of
She
your...
would deny she was my editor. I'm going to give the asterisk. She says, I was not your editor because I looked it up. To be your editor, I have to have power over your salary or professional review. I said, okay, fine. But you assigned me the stories. You edited my stories. That's, to me, my editor, so.
You've also got to be incredibly proud of your son, Theo. He is the youngest recipient of the Polk Award for his work still as a student at Stanford.
Yeah. This is our son who said he would never be a journalist. Went off to college and calls us one day in the fall semester and says, I think I'm going to work for the student paper on this. Okay, great. That sounds great. He called a couple of weeks later and says, I'm investigating the president of the university for misconduct. I'm like, really? You work so hard to get there. Can't you start with a professor? And I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry for any faculty here who might find this worrisome. Don't admit him if he applies for a transfer. But he discovered that the president of the university had been... He's a scientist, and there had been there's a site called PubPeer, PeerPub. Bring it backwards. It's a scientific site where people critique other people's scientific papers, and there were some years-old critiques of this Stanford president's scientific papers saying that there's some falsified data in here. There's photoshopping of the information in these papers and so forth, and nobody had ever done anything about it. Nobody ever really looked into it. Well, he decided to look into it, and he found experts around the country, and he said, please look at this for me when you take a look and tell me what you think. And they said, yeah, there's some real problems here. And he published a story, and the day after, the Board of Trustees of Stanford signed an investigating committee, and the long and short of it is that the president stepped down this summer. So, don't tell me that student journalism doesn't matter. Student journalism matters.
And of course, on the campus of Gannon, we've got to thank the Gannon Knight editors, writers, and staff there. A proud product of which I am, so I owe a lot to them, especially our advisor, Frank Garland. So, of course, student journalism matters, so students in the audience, keep it up. Back to Russia, we talked a lot about, will Putin ever leave? What's the future for Zelensky? I know this is a big what if, but somebody in our audience is asking, was this inevitable, the invasion of Russia into Ukraine? Why didn't we see it coming?
Well, please buy our next book, because this is the big question of the book. Is exactly that. We're trying to go back and look at these last 25 years and say, were there points where we could have done things differently? And there's a debate about that. There are some who say we could have drawn him more in, that we pushed him away. This is the America got it wrong theory of the case. We shouldn't have expanded NATO so much. We were too provocative. We didn't care enough about his interests, about Russian interests. And then there are those who say the opposite, which is that we didn't take seriously that he was never going to be in our camp. He was never going to share our values, and we didn't do enough to deter him when we had the opportunity. He invaded Georgia in 2008. He invaded Ukraine the first time in 2014, and he didn't pay enough of a consequence for it that it would deter him from doing it again. So we're going to look at all these things and try to figure out, this exact question.
Have the sanctions on Russia done anything, been successful?
Well, they made a lot of Russian lives awful, honestly. They have successfully cut off Russia in a lot of ways from the rest of the world. Our friends who live there, they're no longer part of the world, and it's horrible. I mean, the big tragedy is Ukraine. The big tragedy are the people who have gone through an unprovoked war and had their families killed and their cities bombed. But the second tragedy is Russia, a country that also didn't deserve to be dragged into this war by Vladimir Putin and have everything that they built over the last 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union basically thrown away. Their politics may always have been problematic, but as a country, they had grown a middle class. They had grown a more, a better economy. They were connected to the rest of the world. They could see press from the rest of the world. They could travel around the world. All of that's over now. So while sanctions have not changed Putin's calculus, which is, of course, the purpose of them, in that sense, they have not worked, but they have had a big impact on Russia as a country.
Why didn't they let Ukraine into NATO years ago when they let Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and others? Instead, they were told that they could join later. Putin would not have invaded if they had been part of NATO.
Well, and it's a great question, and this is fundamental to our relook back at this. Is what would that have made a difference? And the reason why 2008 was the big moment for this, it was in Bucharest, Romania. I was at this summit for NATO with President Bush. He wanted to admit Ukraine and Georgia, not admit them, but at least put them on track to be admitted, at the very least. And the Europeans resisted. Germany and France didn't want to do that. They thought that would be too provocative to Russia. They thought that would, in fact, anger Putin too much. In fact, he showed up in Bucharest and surprised them and showed up and crashed their dinner of the NATO leaders to make the point that he would not accept Ukraine being a member of NATO. So, you play a lot of what-if games, and we'll play some of them with the book, I suppose. But it's a good. Had they been a member of NATO, no. I don't think Russia would have taken the chance of invading a NATO country. But, there are people who say that would have been too provocative.
Several questions up here asking how we weigh the impact to Palestinian civilians in the Israeli conflict. How do we weigh that right now? With U.S. support to Israel, what do we do about Palestinians?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a huge question. The information released by the Palestinian Gaza Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, and therefore, take that with a grain of salt, is that there have been thousands of people killed. Now, we don't know if that's true, because obviously we can't rely on their word by itself. We also don't know how many of those people who've been killed were Hamas, terrorists, fighters, militants, whatever word you want to use, versus civilians. But obviously, whatever number you want to use, civilians have died. And civilians are being impacted right now by the siege of Gaza, in which water, food, power, medicine has been restricted. And that's a huge issue, and it should be a huge issue. These are not, we can do two things at once, right? To say that we are concerned about civilians in Gaza is not to say that we are not concerned about what happened to Israelis who were murdered and slaughtered and massacred by terrorists on October 7th, right? And unfortunately, sometimes our debate devolves into a black and white thing. We're concerned about one and not the other. We can only be concerned about one, and therefore, if you're concerned about the other, you're wrong. And that's not to say that it's both the same thing. The Israelis, President Biden would say, have a right to defend themselves. Any country, having been attacked the way they were attacked, would respond with overwhelming force. The question is how you use that force, and are there ways to minimize unnecessary deaths? Some people say all deaths are unnecessary. It's a horrible, horrible question, and we as journalists are going to be on the ground to cover what happens in Gaza as much as we can versus what happens with Israel, and present as much information we can for people to make their own judgments.
Should Biden trust Netanyahu? The Israeli people don't seem to.
I heard a no.
Maybe that person wrote the question, or person who wrote the question, you have a friend.
I love the self-answering question. That's great. Look, they have a tense relationship. They have history. They go back on some level 40 years, and they were not very friendly up until 2 weeks ago, and until about 2 weeks ago. So I think Biden hasn't suddenly become, changed his mind about Netanyahu, but I think that they have put that to the side for the moment to stand together. What's interesting from our friends in Israel is how much the Israeli population is blaming Netanyahu right now, right? There's a lot of, normally in a situation like this, there's a rally around the flag, around the leader of a country that's been hit like this. A lot of Israelis, not just the left that doesn't like him, but a lot of Israelis are mad at Netanyahu because they say he is responsible for this. How is he responsible? Well, he let his guard down. He was so busy fighting his internal fights over the judicial reform or about his own trial. Certainly the government, you can argue whether it was him personally or not, grew complacent about what threat was really there from Hamas in Gaza. And there will be a moment, probably not immediately, in which he is going to face a reckoning and have to address that, and we'll see whether he survives. There are a lot of people who think politically he can't survive for a long time as a result. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I wouldn't want to make a prediction. But there's a lot of blowback against him right now.
Do you worry that this is the perfect time for China to attack Taiwan? China, Russia, Iran, North Korea all appear like they would join forces, and this would be the perfect time. Now, I'm questioning the use of the word perfect, but that is a scary good question.
All right, well, let me check and see if it happened. Since
It
we
might
started,
happen while we were on stage.
We've been going about an hour, right? It could have happened. We have no idea. I mean, it feels like anything can happen right now, right? It feels like in the hour we've been here, this could have happened. I mean, I can't judge Chinese calculations. I have to think, though, that one lesson out of Ukraine is that invading Taiwan technically is a country as far as China is concerned, invading another place has its costs and isn't so easy. And that maybe they would take from what happened in Ukraine as a deterrent, not that necessarily the United States would go to war with them, but that, you're swallowing a porcupine. And is that what you really want to do? Now, I don't know if that's how the Chinese look at it or not, but that's what at least some China experts have suggested, that perhaps that they've watched the Ukraine experience and are learning lessons from it. Now, they may learn how to do it better, but it may take more time for them to figure out a different way to approach it. An amphibious assault against an island nation is a little different than Russia, Ukraine across a land border, but it's also harder for us to get help to Taiwan in a timely way than it was for Europe to get help to Ukraine.
Mohammed bin Salman, friend, foe, or something in between?
My friend? No. Not a friend of journalists.
So it's context-free.
Yes, I know.
So you answer that how you wish.
I would say he's not a friend of journalists. As a Washington Post veteran, and I think we should never forget what happened to Jamal Khashoggi. That it tells you a lot about MBS. And let's remember that MBS was, according to the CIA, the author of that grisly killing. Now, we have made friends historically with a lot of really bad people. Stalin was our ally in World War II. Obviously not a great guy. Does that mean we should be allies with him is a big question. President Biden, as a candidate, said we should make MBS in Saudi Arabia a pariah. He decided something different once he became in office. And in fact, what he's trying to do with this negotiation with Saudi Arabia and Israel is to really transform the region. And he's decided that even if as unpleasant or as unseemly as the Saudis may be, that in a realpolitik way, it's worth swallowing that for what he sees as the greater good. But it's a challenge because he's the one who told us that democracy versus autocracy is the challenge of our times, and nobody would say Saudi Arabia comes anywhere close to democracy. So he is struggling with the priorities that he himself set and how to reconcile them.
So we have time for just two more questions, and I'm going to remind folks that immediately following this, we do have a book sale and signing, so head on over to where you came in for the registrations. And of course, a reminder, we've talked about some of the things tonight with other folks coming back from the Global Summit. There are 13 more events coming over the next 3 weeks.
Only getting better.
So we will hopefully see you all again, and we'll see you soon into the future. Peter Baker.
You know what they say about the 185th guy, right?
Right. It's well, I think it's
we try harder.
Right. You try harder. It's Avis. So trying hard right now. Do you see anyone that can unite the House of Representatives as speakers and give leadership to the Republican Party? I can narrow it down and say it could be amongst the 9 that have currently tossed their hat in, assuming that as of 7:30 there were still 9 and that no action has been taken and no votes have been counted while we've been on stage. Do you see someone that the Republican Party can rally around and have leadership in the House?
I would say, without making predictions, I would say none of the 9 is an obvious leader in the sense of like they've been waiting for this guy to come along, right? That doesn't mean that they can't rise to the occasion or that the caucus finally just gets tired and say, fine, we'll take the last person standing and get this over with, right? At some point, they may just simply say enough. But at the moment, none of them is like, we love this person. The person actually, I think, has in some ways sort of the best cross-ideological lines standing right now is actually Patrick McHenry, who's the acting speaker, right? And there is a scenario in which they make him acting speaker with power for a while as sort of a we can't figure it out, so let's just leave that in there and figure it out. And it would not be an ideal solution, and they shot that down when that was floated the other day, but it may come back around to that if they can't get their act together.
So, Peter Baker, I'm going to ask you one last question from our audience here. And before I do it, though, I want to ask you to hold your applause because we'll applaud at the end. I just want to take a moment to, again, thank tonight's sponsors for this Global Summit event, Logistics Plus and Erie News Now. And, of course, I want to thank our wonderful partner, I am biased, I'm an alum, Gannon University, where we are tonight. And I want to remind you that tomorrow night we are back with the Global Summit with a partnership with Gannon University. First time ever, we're featuring Gannon Reads as part of the Global Summit. What a wonderful intergenerational opportunity for learning to happen. Shoulder to shoulder, Dr. Monahana Atisha, public health expert, will be at the Warner Theater. JES folks, I know you've grown accustomed to this over the years at 7:30. That one is at 7 o'clock. We'll see you at the Warner Theater at 7 o'clock. That is tomorrow's event. We are right back here in the Yale Ballroom on Wednesday for Brian Friedman, author of Crushed, How the Changing Climate is Altering the Way We Drink and Eat, a look at the impact on wine industry. Thursday, back here again, midday program, 1 p.m., renowned urbanists Richard Florida and Bruce Katz in conversation, talking about the future of the American city. Erie's one of those. Come to that program on Thursday. And on Friday, we close the week with Matt Weidinger at the JES. We'll welcome you up to our campus at 3207 State Street to learn about poverty and some of the policy in place now and into the future that is working to address that. He is a scholar from the American Enterprise Institute. I thank you all for coming out tonight. This has been wonderful. That last question for the kickoff, the 185th speaker of the Global Summit series. We've talked about the world being on fire, things changing in the last half hour, swallowing porcupines, not dying while on assignment. So, can I end with all the barrage of bad news in the world, Mr. Peter Baker, what are those things that give you hope politically, economically, and environmentally?
Okay, that's my second least favorite question that I get. Because you're looking, I am the optimist, actually. In my family, I am the optimist, but it's a low bar. Look, I still believe that we are, in fact, we are still United States. And I do believe that we go through cycles, right? If you look back at history, yes, this is a tough time, but we've had tough times before. I mean, we have literally had a civil war. We have been at each throats over Vietnam, civil rights, Jim Crow. At the end of the First World War, we were locking people up for dissent, McCarthyism, and we've had tough moments before, and we've come through them. And I believe that we will come through this moment, and that we still have bigger and better days ahead of us. I don't know how we get there, which is why that's my first least favorite question. But I am convinced that we will get there, and that we just need to just remember where we came from and where we want to go.
I know that when we learn how we get there and how we've gotten there, it's because we'll be reading the fine words of Mr. Peter Baker in the New York Times. Folks, join me in issuing a round of applause for Mr. Peter Baker.
Thank you, man. You're great.